Good morning and welcome to the 24th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. And we've received apologies from Mark Griffin MSP, Megan Gallagher MSP and Willie Coffey MSP. And Fulton McGregor is joining us online this morning. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our pre-budget scrutiny. And as a reminder, the committee has agreed to focus on public service reform. And this is the third of evidence session. And today we're joined by Maureen Dixon, who is the regional organiser, and John Mooney, also a regional organiser, both from Unison. And I welcome our witnesses to the meeting. And there's no need for you to operate your microphones. We'll do that for you. And I think what we'll do is we'll just throw our questions out and one or other of you can pick them up. So I'm going to start. So we've got 3 themes. We're going to be going through budget and funding trends. Then we'll go into workforce issues, and then we'll go into some questions around the whole transformation approach. So to start off, I'd be interested to hear your views. So we've been hearing so far in our evidence sessions that there has, I think, off the back of the Verity House Agreement and those conversations, ring fencing has gone down, and also that we're hearing off the back of the UK government's spending review, we're hearing that multi-year funding could be something that could be coming into as an option in the upcoming budget. So I'd be interested to hear what you have seen in terms of that change in ring fencing. And also the potential for multi-year funding. So who wants to pick that one up first? Yeah, John.
Yes, so I think starting with multi-year funding, I think that would be a very welcome way forward for councils and our members within councils. It would give a chance for a level of true strategic planning by the councils in terms of how they're actually going to move forward. We have issues, general concerns about the continued cuts to local government and the real amount of planning that can go into that. You know, we believe that we're at the stage in local government where you have the services you want to provide and the services that you absolutely must provide, and we are losing services all across the country. Anything that mitigates that in any way is more than welcome to us. We believe the reduction in ring fencing has been helpful in that, but I think that you can see from the general stats, from the information centre, for example, where most of the money is spent in local government, that there is still issues in that regard. You know, it's still very much education-based, social care-based. Which, don't get me wrong, is obviously exceedingly important given the demographics of the country. But it leads into a situation where I believe it impacts the wider economy. It impacts our members' ability to move forward in their work because, quite frankly, there is less jobs in other areas. And I believe that some of the impacts that we see across council areas is really down to that kind of imbalance.
Thanks. Anything to add, Maureen? You don't have to have. Yep. Okay. No, well covered, John. Thanks. So you kind of started to touch on the impact on your members, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on previous spending decisions on service, the impact of previous spending decisions on service users and employers. If you could just expand on that a bit more from your view.
Yeah. So from Unison's perspective, local government has fallen well behind other areas in terms of funding. You know, in a time frame where health has gone up by around 20%, you know, local government is actually minus, 0.9% on previous funding deals. So what that has meant is obviously a reduction in service, restrictions across the board. We have a situation where people moving into local government, essentially there's 2 paths. You know, we're talking about those essential frontline services like social care and people who work within schools who aren't teachers. And the reality is, without those services, the other plans that the Scottish Government have in terms of tackling child poverty and the general aim to provide decent public services. Without those jobs, though, that simply couldn't be delivered. But you've got a real juxtaposition there, because whilst we seem to really value these jobs from a intellectual point of view, right, the reality is the money, what these people are paid, isn't comparable to what they can earn elsewhere. So you've got people that can move into other jobs, even within retail these days with the supermarkets, where that kind of money is really competitive. And what you find is that they don't get the same level of hassle, they don't have professional bodies overseeing them, where a mistake doesn't mean you leave your job, a mistake means you leave your career. So, there's a real imbalance there, we believe. On the other side, though, moving away a little bit from those frontline kind of essential jobs that we're talking about, you have a situation where there's a whole host of jobs, a whole host of career paths that have been lessened across the community. So you get people like me, who was brought up in a housing estate in Lanarkshire, who didn't have fantastic school results, but I joined the council in the late 90s as a skill seeker, and I looked around and I seen people who became planning officers and transport officers and, and all trading standards, all of that kind of thing. And there was an ability there for people to get in the door and work their way up and build themselves into a career, which not only is good for them and their family, but actually adds to the country. The ability to do that has been severely lessened. These types of roles, community learning development is another great example. These types of roles have taken hit after hit over the last 10, 15 years. And our concern is that any plans for budgets going forward, particularly with the plan, but it seems to be a plan to kind of bring in AI to move out some kind of back office roles and stuff like that. And the general plan, what we believe to be the general plan, across the public sector in Scotland to reduce staffing levels, that will do nothing to fix that. And we believe that the country is actually missing out in various different ways through this path.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the expectations that service users, whether that's, parents of children that are at schools or clients using social care or whatever, the expectations that the public have on local government services is far greater now than it ever has been. And we reached a point about 6 or 7 years ago where the size of the local government workforce really reduced. So we find, as a consequence of that, that sickness absence levels have gone up amongst workers that are trying to muddle through with greater expectations around how much work they can pack into their 36 hours a week than we've ever had before. And all of that has a knock-on effect. And as John rightly says, the salaries that some of our members, I'm thinking particularly in schools, because we've spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 years working with people in schools, some of the salaries that they earn and the role that they are required to do and the expectations from parents around what they expect these people to do has just grown greatly, and I worry about how long that the restrictions and the reduction of the workforce. I worry about how much longer local government will be able to sustain that direction of travel.
I'm going to bring in another thread to the conversation, and John, you can kind of weave that into what else you want to come back in there. So I think you've both kind of like touched into this as well. So what we're aware of in the conversation as well is that there's an increased level of dissatisfaction around council services. And I think I wonder what you think about the idea that do we need to have a national conversation with people, which is that, as you've said, there's been a big shift in the focus around education services and social work services certainly taking the bulk of the budget. And are most people living in their local authority and their council area aware that that's what's happened? And so then when we're looking at things like cuts to leisure services or libraries, people are not aware that there's this greater demand weighing on councils than You know, so I just wonder, do we need to start to talk to people a bit more about that shift?
So I think we do. I think the point I was going to make actually ties in very well to this. I think that the general dissatisfaction, if you like, with council services is actually really dangerous. I think it leads to a lack of trust in public services in general. I think that that plays a part in some of the protests we've been seeing on our streets in recent weeks. And I think, you know, I think in terms of an understanding of exactly how council funding works, I just don't think it's there. I think that if you're directly engaging with councillors, you know, if you're the type of constituent who has gone along to a surgery or whatever, then yes, in my experience, lots of councillors are happy to explain these things to you. But I don't think the general person on the street really does understand that. Also, again, I think I think it can be difficult for councils because they're in that situation where they want to be saying to people, we are your council, we are providing these services to you. These are your local decision makers, you know, you should elect them, etc., etc. And then say, but actually we're kind of limited as to what we can do in this area. We know you want this, but actually we're ring-fenced to deliver that. There's also the whole thing about demographics. I don't think demographics is understood at all. I think that there's a decent level of understanding within Unison members as to what the demographics of the local council area is. But again, that's not universal. You know, I don't want to mislead you, that's not universal either. But I think there's a real issue with the public truly understanding, you know, the social care, I don't need to tell you, is a ticking time bomb. You know, the demand for social care is only going to get greater, and the issues that we've touched on about pay and the agility of local authorities and of course their partners in health to actually, I worry about their agility at a local level to do what's actually required in each council area. You know, that's a concern of mine. You're talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the public realise the pressures on local government until they try to access the services. I mean, if you take some of the libraries and sports centres and things like that, you know, I think if you're of my generation, you just expect them to always be there, and then you go to use it one day and it's not there. And if you do the jobs that John and I do, then you're aware of all the cuts and the arm's length organisations that have been set up and the pressures that have been put on them to deliver budget and efficiency savings for the local authorities. But, you know, I completely agree with John around the pressures on social care. I've got an elderly mother who lives with me and who had a couple of half-hour social care appointments every week, and the moment she moved in with myself and my husband, that was stopped, because that was a particular decision my local council area made in conjunction with the local health board to remove what they considered to be perhaps non-essential social care, help to live at home deliveries. And you know, that was really difficult for us as a family to get our heads round. It was very difficult for her to understand. And I think the assumption's just made, well, she lives with a relative, so therefore you can do it. But, you know, you work full time, you've got a demanding job, it all has a knock-on effect and it puts pressure out to everybody else. That's a tiny, tiny little example of the pressures that there are within social care. You know, that is absolutely a ticking time bomb. And I think as we rely more and more on the third sector to deliver social care for us as well, unless the Fair Work agenda is properly implemented and is delivering as it should be, then that also adds a lot of extra pressure into the situation.
Yeah, that's certainly the case where you've got a situation with third sector often being run by volunteer boards, and yeah, that's an added layer. But so I was going to ask about social care, but you've actually covered that really nicely. And Maureen, it's great to get your direct personal story, because as you say, that's one story in many, many families across Scotland. I'd like to move on to the fiscal framework. That's come up a few times in our conversation. And I remember years ago when Kate Forbes was here as a I don't know what minister, finance minister I think she was at the time, yes. And that came up for the first time when I was convener. And that kind of who's responsible for the fiscal framework, and the Scottish Government and COSLA are agreeing to work on that as part of the Verity House agreement. But within that framework is the funding formula. And that got pointed to, I think, a couple of evidence sessions ago as that's the thing that needs to be addressed, where, you know, the formula that spreads out based on various criteria, the allocation for each local authority. And it seems to be nobody really wants to address that. But I just, in general, would be interested to hear what your thoughts are on the fiscal framework in general, but also the funding formula.
I mean, I think that very broadly speaking, we welcomed, we welcomed the Verity House agreement, with COSLA and Scottish Government working together more on these issues. I think, if I was being honest, I think that we would probably like to see COSLA have a bit more power, or a bit more, maybe be able to push a little more on that side of things, make it more of a genuine equal partnership, respectfully. That's something that we would like to see. At the end of the day, COSLA, whilst we negotiate with them, obviously, for our members for pay deals, etc., the reality is they are the umbrella body. They know what local government needs, and they should generally be listened to. In terms of the funding formula, I don't really know, to be honest. What can I say? I mean, I think it's really key that the formula is up to date and as accurate as it needs to be. I've already mentioned a couple of times changing demographics. You've got different council areas with different requirements, more rural communities, whatever the case may be. I think that that's really key. I think that against the backdrop of what I outlined earlier, where local government is certainly falling behind other areas in terms of funding, and if I'm honest, makes that feel as if in terms of priority as well. Certainly that's how my members feel. I think it's more important than ever to have the formula correct. If there's not an endless envelope there, to provide funding, then that funding really needs to be going to the right places in the right manner.
I mean, I completely agree with what John said, but just going back to the Verity House agreement, I think, a partnership works better if both sides are equal, and I don't think that's quite been achieved yet. And I certainly know from the last couple of years where Unison is one of the bodies that's been involved in local government pay negotiations, there's only so far we can go with our conversations with COSLA, because when they don't have the money, they have to come to the Scottish Government. So the balance isn't quite as it should be.
A work in progress, I think. I mean, I think this committee's done a good job on kind of really trying to support that balance, and also the conveners group in the Parliament have recently met with the COSLA leader body to try to say, oh, COSLA is an organisation, the Parliament's an organisation, how do we work together in a better way? And I hope that those are the kinds of things that support the government as well to work well with COSLA, because creating an atmosphere of respect. I think, John, you used that word. Just before we move on to workforce issues, do you have any other comments that you'd just like to bring up with us around what you think's required from the forthcoming Scottish Government budget?
So
yeah, John.
I've got a bit of a general comment, and I'm paraphrasing a little, but if the First Minister's priorities are growing the economy, tackling child poverty, tackling the climate emergency, and obviously delivering high quality and sustainable public services, we think there's some real issues there in what the plan appears to be moving forward. In terms of growing the economy, we believe local government can play a big part in that in various different manners. I've touched on it a little bit already. Child poverty is obviously key, and it's often the most vulnerable in our society who really depend on local government services. So, you need as much support. And it's not just about the frontline staffs, because if you're looking after vulnerable children, you need the ability for the backroom to, compile those reports, make sure there's the oversight, make sure the social worker doesn't have 45 cases, right? That actually they've got 25 cases and therefore someone isn't going to slip through the net, right? And that's all part of that high quality, sustainable public service, isn't it? And our concern is that an over-reliance on AI going forward could actually impact quite a few of those things. Number one, AI is no substitute for an experienced backroom member of staff who's reviewing a case in some way, or is making sure people get paid on time, or whatever the case may be. But secondly, it's also really bad for the environment. So if we're talking about tackling the climate emergency, we're talking about cutting public service staff over the next however many years it is, and we're going to replace it with something that's actually going to make it harder for us to reduce our carbon footprint, I don't really see how that's going to work. So, as a general comment, I'm not sure that's the direction of travel, and I think that for all sorts of reasons that we've already discussed today, I think that really what we need to do is get a fair funding settlement for local government, allow those local decisions to be made, and actually get some confidence back in Scotland again.
Super, that's great. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That I like that you made the connection between the experienced people who can take on a social work case or whatever and really understand the nuances of that, and also the fact that AI uses a great deal of power, and you connected that to the climate, tackling the climate emergency. We're going to move on to workforce issues, and I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You've already highlighted some of the areas I'm going to try and touch on, but there is no doubt that you have an ageing population within the workforce, and that has a knock-on effect. And in some areas of some departments, like social care or social work, you've touched on that already, and community roles, which have been and are vitally important within the context of local government and within your own local area. But having that ageing population and the retention and recruitment issues that you've having to manage, that has a knock-on effect when it comes to the ability to provide that. And you've already once again touched on the problems that are happening with sickness absence, because people are being asked to do more and their timescale is less, and trying to manage that and deal with the workload has had a detrimental effect on many of your members, and we've seen that and we're aware of that. So it would be good to get a flavour of how you think that is growing, and if it is, and I think you will probably say that the thickness abscess is growing and the retention issues are still growing, how you tackle that. Because if you're not able to provide the services, if you don't have the frontline service personnel there doing the role, then there will be problems further down the road.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Sickness absence levels have increased, but it's not just what's going on within the workplace. There are other external factors, cost of living crisis, etc., as well, that are impacting on that. But local government has been restricting for so many years, that this is a year-on-year build-up of less people, greater expectation, and if we take away some of the backroom services who enable the frontline services, then those jobs have still got to be done by somebody, and they get passed on to frontline services. So the problem just snowballs. It just gathers snow as it goes down the line, and the levels to which the public are now placing demands on those services is growing at the same time as local government is restricting. So, I mean, we need to be making local government an attractive employer for the younger generations. I mean, like John, well, I was slightly earlier than John. I started working in finance and pensions in local government back in 1989, and you thought all your Christmases had come at once, because you could see the opportunities that were there within local government were vast. They were great, and it was somewhere that you wanted to work, and you wanted to be proud of the fact that you worked there, and I was. But I think we've lost a lot of that, because there are more attractive jobs, or you can get the same level of salary in other jobs where you've got far less responsibility. I mean, we have, I worked quite closely with social work colleagues until about 18 months ago, and some of the horror stories that we had coming out of there of people working 70-hour weeks and never having a break, because they were working weekends as well, because they could not switch off, because the numbers of cases that they were carrying, and because of the pride they had in the role that they were carrying out in the community, and the sense of responsibility they felt towards the people that they were working with. But that's just not sustainable. We need to find a way to make these roles more attractive, and to make local government an employer again that people want to work in.
I mean, John, I'm sure, but I think you make a very valid point about the respect of the role and the respect of the organisation. And in the past, the council may have had a perception of what the role and responsibilities were, and that's why both of you went into it. You've said that, but that has changed. And the demands upon you, the salami slicing of budgets over now decades as to what is expected, it cannot do anything but have an impact on the morale of the workforce that you're trying to represent. And as I say, if job satisfaction isn't there any longer, or there's a perceived loss of that, then why would you go into that role and take on a workload that's going to make you potentially ill, because some people are doing that? Thank you, John.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think essentially local government needs to have a future. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. You know, people within local government have watched cut after cut. They've watched job freeze after job freeze. They've had to carry the workload. You know, regardless of what the media might think, people in local government care. People in local government care about doing a good job, and they understand the responsibility of public service. But the problem is when you are continually told, and I don't mean verbally necessarily, but when you're continually told that you don't matter, when it's cuts yet again, right, or that role isn't being filled, so you just need to muddle along and we'll do what we can. Or, as I said, you come in and actually the career opportunities that you thought were once there are now gone. Because, there's a lot of things spoken about, well, let's get rid of some middle roles and stuff like that. Well, the reality is that means there's a 5-grade jump between you who've just come in and your any chance of promotion, right? So, in that environment, then you get a situation where people are turning elsewhere. And the reality is, for the good of this country, I strongly believe we can't afford to have people turning elsewhere. People need to understand that local government is a viable option as a career, and that it is a rewarding option, both financially but also in terms of job satisfaction and knowing that you're delivering for people in your local community in most cases. I don't have stats in front of me, but clearly most people in local government work in their own, roughly in their own community. So, it's difficult to generalise across 32 councils. But, the fact that we've got an ageing workforce is no surprise. We're now reaping what we sown a few years back. When you stop recruiting, when there's, the job freezes, temporary jobs, all of that kind of things, even little things, well, say it's not a little thing, but, even things like changes to pensions and stuff over the years, right? All of these things make a difference. And it's really about local government needs to be valued, and local government workers need to be valued, and there's a whole media campaign there. We try and pick up the slack on that as a trade union, but you're limited in what we can do. I think we should all be pulling together on that personally, But yeah, that's why we are where we are.
And, we all understand that there's a need for workforce reduction and workforce planning to ensure that you're effective and efficient. But even when it comes to the management of the council, elected representatives are given budget pressures by the officials within the organisation to say, well, we need to look at the following, and it's a 3 or a 4 or an 8% reduction across the board, so that leisure and culture lose it, and housing, health, whatever, it doesn't matter. Every single department has not gone forward with a budget increase in recent years, and that makes it harder for the management of the organisation to manage that, and elected representatives to then have to deal with the processes. Because, I spent nearly 2 decades in local council before I came here, and I've been here a decade. So in that time, I've seen even more erosion of individuals and processes. And you're just confirming that today. So when it comes to workforce reduction and workforce planning, what do you see is what is required if you're able to maintain and sustain? Because if you don't have that workforce reduction and you don't have that planning, then you've already told me that departments and functions and roles have vanished.
But I think that comes back to, that comes back to the kind of multi-year budget, doesn't it? That comes back to knowing the framework that you're actually having to work for over a period of time, and that allows you to do that planning. Because, obviously in every council, the elected council will have their own political plans for the services that they want to deliver, won't they? They'll have their own... I remember 10 years ago speaking to a leader of the council saying, John, I used to have sleepless nights wondering how we could best spend the money, right? What new service could be developed that would help these people in View Park or whatever, right? Now, these same people are having to make cuts. No one gets elected to make cuts, right? We do understand that. But, they need a level of certainty, don't they, to actually move from. But the problem is, at this stage, we have had so long such a... I'm using too strong of words, that's why I'm trying to think of my words, but we've had such, we've got such, I was going to say deprivation, it was maybe a bit strong, but we've had so many cuts over the years from local government. We're not starting from a level playing field, we're not starting from where we want to be. So even if we're in a situation where elected officials and their appointed officers have a 2, 3, 5 year budget to actually work from, the first 2, they're going to be making up ground essentially for that period. It's not an instant fix on its own. Sorry, Mo.
No, that's okay. I think local government falls foul of not having had the investment in it that other public services have had, and that's just where we are. I think I can safely say that the members we have working in local government feel like the poor relations. They feel like they are at the sharp end of the cuts. They will be at the bottom of the list when budgets are handed out. That's the way that people feel. And it's horrible to say that people just expect that is the way it's going to be now, and that councillors will sit around the table, working with council officers, trying to work out which service they're going to cut next. So there really has to be some investment in local government. There really needs to be a shift in the mindset, because continuing to take money out of local government, we've gone past that. There needs to be investment.
And my final question would be about, once again, you've touched on the corporate functions in comparison to the frontline services. And that has been seen as an easy option sometimes to try and think, well, we can lose, but by losing the backroom function or the corporate function, that has a knock-on effect on the frontline services. So a little bit of flavour as to how you think that should be reformed or moved around, because it's not working.
Those backroom services enable the frontline services. With both John and I worked in finance when we were in local government. So, I worked in payroll. If you don't pay people, they're not going to turn up for work. So, those are really core roles. And if those roles are not being done, the frontline services will end up having to pick up some of that, which then means they're not available to provide the services that they are fundamentally there to provide. So, I mean, from my perspective, there probably are some better ways of working. I'm not talking about mass centralisation or anything like that, but collaboration between local authorities when it comes to procurement and things like that. I don't believe that AI is the answer to everything moving forward. I think, again, when I was involved with our social work issues group, we looked at that. And it certainly has a place to play. I haven't personally used it myself, but it does. There is a role for it within all industries. But we need to be careful about how far we go with that, because people like to communicate and deal with people, and we disenfranchise a large section of our population, people who cannot interact with AI. Our elderly community who don't have the facilities to interact with AI and just aren't able to do that. So I think that's not the answer, but neither is targeting or continue to target the backroom services as a way of front-loading frontline services, because it just has a knock-on effect.
Can I just come in on that? I think we need to be careful. Right. I think we need to be careful by saying that, OK, we'll take some efficiencies and it'll be from the back office, right? Because the reality is, we've been saying that since 2010, right? Rhetorical question, where do you think the cuts have been coming from 2010, right? You know, the so-called fat on the bone has been removed in local government, right? The back services have already been cut. You know, what we need to do is to make sure that we're making the most use of technology that we possibly can. And I'm not necessarily talking about AI there, it's just about normal systems and stuff like that. We need to also make sure that we're not creating a false economy, because, like Mo, you spoke about frontline workers needing to do certain things. It also happens the other way, where you get rid of someone who earns 25 grand a year, and that means somebody that earns 40 grand a year is now having to pick up their tasks, so you're not getting value for money within your pay bill either. So I think we need to be careful. I don't think we should, with the greatest respect, I don't think we should rush to assume that there's lots of back office functions there to actually be cut, not without there being genuine impact on the ground going forward.
Thank you, Convener.
I believe Fulton McGregor wants to come in with some supplementaries around workforce issues, but also, Fulton, could you ask your, I think AI, you were going to ask AI, but I think we've covered that quite sufficiently there, but there's also digital literacy questions I think you had as well. If you just want to pick those up as well, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me?
Fulton McGregor's going to ask some questions, yeah. Hopefully he's there. He did indicate that he wanted to come in on this. Okay, maybe we'll just, okay, so we'll come back to that. We'll park that. Evelyn, if you could pick up your questions, that would be great.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel, and it's lovely to see you here today, and thanks for your answers so far. Been very helpful. My question is around transformation. What does Unison think the term means? Because when we've been taking evidence, I can see you smiling already, when we've been taking evidence from others, it's quite clear that it means different things to different people.
What do we think it means, or what have we been taught that it means?
You could do both.
So I think, you know, genuinely, I think in our experience, what it means to Unison members is that there's a chance they're facing cuts, right? That there's going to be a direct impact on their ability to do their job, etc., etc. You know, because, you know, sadly, all of the transformation has been aimed at cutting costs. You know, so it's essentially a kind of Pavlovian response, right? I think from Unison's point of view, transformation, you know, transformation in itself isn't a dirty word within Unison, right? You know, we understand that we're in a modernising world that there is different ways to do jobs, better ways to do jobs. We believe that our members are capable of making changes and that we can bring them with us. Convener mentioned digital literacy. There's perhaps an issue in there that needs to be addressed, but that's not the end of the world. But I think the problem is that quite often it is looked at suspiciously because of what the end result always is. It is very rarely in local government that transformation is about actually getting better for better's sake, and it's actually about, well, we need to find a different way to do this that will save us £1 million, by the end of the year. So is that fair, do you think?
I think that is fair, and I think the problem with the word transformation is that it is always framed around a cuts agenda in local government. Even if you look at the proposals around the National Care Service, the National Social Work Agency, that I think our members find it difficult sometimes to buy into a lot of these things because automatically we've had years of transformation, as I say, framed with cuts. So people are initially and often quite rightly suspicious about what any form of transformation in local government is going to look like. And if we specifically take the part around AI in the transformation plans, I'm sure our members will automatically just see that as my role won't exist anymore because a computer's going to do that for me.
So you both feel that the term has negative connotations instead of efficiency, doing things well, getting better?
Born from experience.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. The Accounts Commission has stated that reform in councils is increasingly urgent. What are your views on this?
I think probably the emphasis that we would have is more around investment. It is urgent, but we would see that the way to resolve that is around investment in public services and not continue to restrict them. So I do agree that it is urgent, but I think perhaps the solutions that we might come to the table with might be different from others.
I think reform in councils is obviously potentially a very wide term, and I think that Unison would have various different views on various different aspects of it. So, for example, I know we've spoken a lot about council funding here, and we've been talking about from, a Scottish Government point of view, the allocation of funds. But you look at council tax, there's been talk that council tax is going to be reformed for, I don't know, 15 years, something like that, right? So Unison's view on that is that we would welcome that, as long as it is done in a way where those who can afford to pay more would pay more. But there's different types of reform that, to be honest, we would have different views on. So do you mean, and I'm not rhetorically, do you mean we're going to go back to Lothian Regional Council, or do you mean there's some shared services, or do you mean that actually the whole remit of local government's going to change a little bit and we're going to decide how we do things? Because we're already concerned, as Maureen mentioned earlier, we're already concerned about the over-reliance on the third sector, for certain types of services, particularly social care. And, I led on social care at the time of the pandemic, and, the Scottish Government's general view was that because so much of it was outsourced, to the third sector, they didn't have as much control as they would have liked to during the pandemic to be able to protect people, both workers and obviously constituents. So, I think we're in danger of repeating that mistake, personally. But, it really depends what that reform means. We believe that local government is valuable. We believe that it plays a real, genuine part in the fabric of this country. And we believe that local government should therefore grow as it goes forward. It should remain unmolested, rather than we're going to reform, we'll stick some stuff in health, we'll put some stuff in the third sector, and, you guys can look after the bins. I know I'm being slightly facetious. Hopefully you take my point.
I think as well, just to add to that, that the cost of reform is really important, and I think, you know, we find it difficult as an organisation, our members find it difficult when millions of pounds are spent looking at reform and it's not been the right solution. And in the process, that has cost tens of millions of pounds to get to a point where somebody said, well, actually, that's actually not the direction of travel that we need to take. And that's really difficult for our members who are trying to do a really good job and are having budgets cut, and over here millions of pounds have just been wasted looking at some type of reform that's never going to happen. That's really hard for people to accept.
Thank you for that.
Fulton is with us. He's always been with us. We've just had a bit of a technical issue of getting him up on the screen and getting his mic turned on. So good to see you here. I'm going to pass back to you now. If you wanted to come in on anything around, oh, his image is gone. So I'll keep talking and hopefully he's still there. Pass back to you. And if there's anything you want to pick up on workforce issues and then just pick up the remaining questions that you have, that would be great. No? Okay. Okay. Well, I will then pick the questions up. Yeah, so we were interested in understanding, in the context of transformation, but it is connected to workforce, is the need for training in digital literacy to ensure a workforce is capable of navigating changes and challenges. And I kind of hear that on the backdrop of that suspicion that's there, right? But absolutely there are. So AI aside, there are tremendous opportunities with digital literacy. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think there is. I think that is absolutely something that we should be looking at. I think that would allow for the planning and delivery of services to only improve. You know, in an ideal world, you have systems picking up functions that actually make people's jobs easier on a day-to-day basis. You know, and maybe you start to chip away at some of the problems that we've had, particularly since the pandemic, where people are overworked and stressed, and, you know, we've already spoken about the sickness stuff. I think that going hand in hand with investment in services, you know, just actually picking up on Maureen's previous point there, actually, about, you know, the kind of perceived wasting of money. So we currently have a situation within local government where all too often we will spend a lot of money on a system which, don't get me wrong, is needed and if working perfectly is great. But then it's about the people who are using the system, and are they actually use the system to the level that it's actually required, and the stress that's put upon them. And I'm thinking, you know, family-wise, for example, you know, my mother-in-law is a school cleaner. You know, you've got the online HR systems and stuff now. That's a challenge for people, you know. And it's about, as well as investing in those systems, it's about, is your technology that you're giving people to use it actually up to scratch? Because there's a difference between you know, I can attest, I've got a Unison phone, right? You know, it technically does the job, but does it do the job? You know, so you've got that part of it. But then you've got the part about rolling out the training for people. And it's about making sure that your people on the ground are actually bought in, invested, able to do the thing that you're asking them to do. Not that they're having to go away and get a group of their colleagues and then they're all, you know, there's all those different sides of it. So digital services, we think, are keen. We're not convinced on AI for a number of reasons, particularly at this. I would still argue AI is at a very early stage, and I think that we could be throwing good money after bad in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and just to add, I think what's important as well is that the technology has to fit the service and not the other way around, and that's what we're seeing happening quite a lot, that things are the wrong way around.
I see that Fulton has joined us again, or he's always been here, but Fulton, do you want to pick up on the questions around collaboration and the union's involvement in public service reform?
Yeah, I've also got a question on the back of Alexander's Stuart's line of questioning where I tried to come in earlier. convener, if that's okay as well. So good morning to the panel. I think your evidence session has been really good. I apologise. Perhaps ironically, actually, there's been some issues with the technology here. Who says that we don't plan these things, you know? So almost making the point in some of the questions that I'm going to come on to. So there was an issue that both my camera and my mic couldn't be accessed at one point. So I have been here and I've heard the session, and a good old logging off and logging back on again seemed to work. So there you go. Sometimes it's not too technical. I wanted to come back to the issues around about the workforce firstly, before I come on to my main lines of question. Because I thought that was a really interesting discussion. Just for clarity, I was a local government employee myself, a social worker, for 12 years. And I loved my job and I loved being a council employee. And I've done those 70 hours that were referred to. I remember them well. But one of the things that I think, and also should say probably for Declaration of Interest, as a Unison member the whole time of that as well, one of the things that struck me when I was working there, and which strikes me when constituents come to see me when there's changes within councils, is their place in that decision making. Often they feel that these decisions are just taken, whether that's by high hegians, as we call them, or whether it's by councillors, or maybe a mixture of both, but really that they're not involved in it. It's almost like, I remember many times when we were losing services or whatever the case might be, you just get told that that's what was happening, and that really was the end of it. Do you both have any ideas about how workers can be more involved in the decision-making process? How can they be involved in saying that these services that should be going or not going, or is that too complicated for councils to do? Because obviously everybody would just want no services to go, but if you start from a point where there has to be some form of cuts in the current climate, how are workers kept involved in that process? Have you got any ideas, perhaps?
I mean,
you convener who goes or whatever, you know, as I'm not in the room.
Yeah.
John, go on.
I think from a Unison perspective, we play that role as much as we can. So whenever an employer starts consulting with us on general plannings or where things might be going, then as long as it's not something that's confidential, we would be speaking to our members in the area, taking their feedback and trying to bring it to the table. So that's certainly a role that the trade unions provide in general. In terms of the council, I think there needs to be a level of realism with consultation. You know, I've been in a situation when I worked for the council where there was consultation around, you know, how a service should be taken forward, and I've seen councils do public consultations as well, you know, this is what we're thinking, you know, what would you like to see us focus on, etc. In my experience, those types of things run up against reality, you know, which is the council needs to make a cut, and actually, because of, particularly in the past, because of the ring fencing, it needs to be in this area. So it doesn't actually matter if we've got a great idea for how a service could expand, or the fact that, you know, the people of, you know, Edinburgh want to see more, you know, planting or whatever the case would be, you know. So those things are often kind of fraught with, even if you do the consultation and you do have the conversations, the reality is a hard decision needs to be made somewhere, and it's similar to the point that we made, you know, that we made earlier on. You know, reform is great, but not if at the end of the day it's to take a zero off at the end. So I think that's kind of generally the issues that we come up against. I also think there's a real issue. Our members on the ground, there's a perception that there's not a real understanding of what their job is like. So there's an understanding of the output, you know, what your job kicks out, you know, or what statutory provision is covered by you doing your job. But there's a feeling, and you know, please don't misunderstand me, you know, this answer calls for a bit of generalisation. I do accept that. But there is a feeling, you know, generally that no one knows what your actual 8 hours a day actually looks like. So therefore, when you're making the decisions, and this takes us back to why they're not consulted, of course, right? But this takes us back to you're making a decision at a higher level to deliver things in a certain way, to achieve certain goals, and the reality is that just doesn't compute with a home support worker who's got 20 visits to make that day, right? Or that doesn't compute with, you know, a school janitor who's now covering 3 schools instead of 1. You know, I don't know how they get their bucket of sawdust. I don't know how they do it, you know. But, you know, these are the real issues that are on the ground, and we need a real understanding. We need more understanding from the decision makers as to what a day in the life is actually like, rather than just what the output of that is.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think our members not being listened to, not feeling that they are being consulted on the direction of travel, ultimately leads to conflict. And then we spend a whole load of time in conflict, and that detracts away from the direction of travel that we all need to go in. I mean, when Unison are there to work in partnership often with employers to try and make transition and change as easy as possible whilst feeding in the views of our members. And when that doesn't happen, or it often leads to the conflict. And we do have lots of local government employers who might leave it to the last minute before they come to talk to us, or often don't talk to us until it's too late. So then the staff that work there don't feel like they've had any buy-in to the changes that are being made. And human nature, you will be resistant to those changes if you don't understand them, you're suspicious of them, or you just don't think that they are in the best interests of the council or the service users either. So I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that sometimes the decision makers don't always understand what the role is. And the people that carry out the role have got the expert knowledge. So there has to be a balance there. And there has to be a bit of respect as well, that the views of those individuals are really important.
Yeah. No, I think they're good points that you've made, and you know, I do think that Unison do generally a good job. I think that sometimes though it's when people are hearing about decisions. So that's actually nothing to do with Unison or the people who are affected, but often people are hearing about there's a paper going to a council committee meeting, and they maybe hear about it online because somebody happens to share it, and it's only several weeks away. And then there's a bit of a catch-up. And there was a situation, which I'm sure you both will be aware of, in North Lanarkshire fairly recently, where there was a change into the grading of early years workers, which caused an enormous outroar. I think every MSP, MP and councillor's surgeries were inundated for weeks afterwards. But what happened there was it was the consultation, the discussions with workers. There wasn't enough time from when that was happening to the decisions being made. So that's just an anecdotal point that I wanted to put on the record. Convener, can I just check, did you feel, because there was a wee bit of me logging on and off a bit ago, did you feel that the sort of AI digital literacy stuff was covered, did you say? Because I think that was around about the time I was logging off and back on to try and repair the problems.
Yes, Fulton, I think we covered that one. I think we've got that one sufficiently. We bottomed that one out, I'll say. So if you want to move on to the collaboration and the involvement in the Public Service Reform Board, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
That's great, Convener. I just wanted to check that. Okay, so for the next question, I wanted to ask a wee bit about how you think sort of collaborative work between the council and other organisations or services is going. Obviously, the key example in this would be the integrated joint boards, you know, community planning partnerships, things like that. How do you think sort of that collaborative work is going, in your opinion, as a union? And is there any more that we can that can be done to improve these relationships and improve services?
That's a loaded question.
Loaded questions.
I have experience, obviously, of working with integrated joint boards here, but before I moved back up to Scotland, I worked down in the southwest of England, so integration between health and social care down there was full integration, which led to private companies, which led to all manner of difficulties, and so I've seen both sides of it. But the reality of the situation is that they could be a lot better. I mean, I've sat in integrated joint board meetings where, you know, health and local government are, I don't think, working together the way that the Scottish Government envisaged they would. And there are lots of barriers to that. They are two separate employers. The integrated joint boards are not employers. So when you have, if I take occupational therapists, for example, so we've got occupational therapists in local government and in health, they're being paid differently, they're doing slightly different jobs. It's not ideal. There are definitely improvements that could be made just from integrated services. Because they're not fully integrated, and I'm not saying that they should be fully integrated, because I've seen how that works down in England, and it wasn't ideal down there either. I don't have the solution to it, though. That's the only problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a great deal to add, to be honest. I think you're absolutely right, Mo. In my experience, you know, in various different integrated boards in different areas in Lothian and in Lanarkshire, Forth Valley area, it isn't what I assume it isn't working the way that it was perhaps envisaged by the Scottish Parliament. You know, that it's not necessarily smooth sailing all the time. You know, people, it's human nature. Organisations have their own priorities, and they're bringing their own baggage to the table, you know, and that can be borne out in how things work in real life. And just to make the further point, you know, that Maureen made about occupational therapists, we've got situations in, you know, with like addiction workers who are not only the same issue, paid at different levels and stuff like that, but literally sitting at the same group of desks. You know, so you know, and again, Unison aren't in favour of there being one employer, you know, to be clear. But the reality is there is a real issue there. You know, if Mo and I are sitting beside each other, essentially doing the same job, wearing two different badges and getting paid two different amounts of money, and, you know, associated other conditions, you know, so there's those kind of issues on the ground.
Just to add to that as well, thinking about technology and things, I mean, the different staff are accessing different software, different packages and things as well. So that brings its own challenges and its own difficulties, because if you're trying to refer a service user through the full range of services they are entitled to, you've got multiple people that it needs to go through and multiple different types of software that it's going through as well.
Well, hang on a minute. Just Fulton, okay, because I've got one as well. But so, Fulton, did you want to continue with that line of questioning, or do you want to move on? Because we've got supplementaries in the room specifically around the collaboration.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to still ask was about the union's role at a national level, public service reform stuff. So if you want me to ask that just now, or just leave it, it's up to you.
Let's hold off and go into these SUPs on the collaboration bit. So, Alexander, you want to come in, and then I might have something as well.
You know, you've touched on the difficulties that are experienced at the moment through the social care and the integrated joint boards. And what we have seen of late is the amount of agency staff that have had to be brought into some of these cases. And I think a report came out last week that showed, you know, that over the last 5 years, been about 300 million has been spent on that. And you know, in my own area of Clackmannanshire, I think, you know, it's been quite a huge sum of money that's been required. So we're not able to provide the staff from our own area. So agency has to be brought in at an extra cost that once again erodes the situation and financial pressures then become even more intense for your own members and for the workforce that plan to be there on a day-to-day basis, because they are being pushed into that situation because there's not the staff, but the funding still needs to be met, and that it is being paid, and that money is being used to substitute that situation, and that must have a knock-on effect with the process and your own members.
I mean, what you've just described there is actually the worst of all worlds, in my view, because what you've got is, I mean, we've already spoken about wages and how people are valued in general, adding to the fact that you don't have the staff. Then you bring in agency staff, where the money that you're paying for that is going to prop up a private business somewhere, right? The real money that you're paying, the real hourly rate, isn't going to the actual practitioner. So that means that, and there's a risk about what level of skill you're actually buying in. You know, sadly, we see this on a day-to-day basis. So you, as an employer, so if you're Clackmannanshire Council, for example, right, you've got no control over, you know, you've got a reduced amount of control over the training and the understanding and the delivery of that service at an inflated price. And it's an absolute false economy, and there's too much of that across local government in general. And that is why all of the stuff that we've been talking about, we need to get that right, because if we get that right, we simply don't need to rely on this. You know, and that's the key word. Can you rely on that? Because you're not in control of the workforce.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah, I wanted to. So we've been talking about collaboration, and that's an idea that came out of the work on the Christie Commission, that we are needing to move towards the kind of more joined up approach and collaborating together across agencies. But I just wonder, so Maureen, you said you didn't think you had any solutions, but if we could pull it back away from IJB and community planning partnerships specifically, and think a bit about, from your experience, and you may not have an idea now, but you could come back to us, what do you think we need to do more of in order to get that genuine collaboration? What's happening? Are there skill sets around collaboration, about do we need to support people to recognise the willingness by giving up your own kind of corner in a way and stepping in, that actually leads to something better, that is ultimately what we're trying to do with the public services reform? So
I mean, I wonder if local government as an organisation and health as an organisation really have a true understanding of what one another does. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's quite basic, you know, right. That if that's an underlying basic problem, then it all unravels immediately, doesn't it? If you put two huge organisations side by side and they don't understand one another, and that's a frustration I find sometimes sat in if you just look at integrated joint boards, for example. That is the basic understanding. So, you know, they might want to achieve something, and how you would achieve that in health is really different on how you would achieve it in local government. Uh-huh. So it's the types of organisations that you're putting together that can be problematic to start off with.
John?
I would just add, I agree totally. I would just add that Unison strongly believe in local democracy. We believe in local government, we believe in councils, and I think that then creates almost an immediate barrier to what you're saying, because in reality we believe that, just because it was mentioned, you know, Clackmannanshire Council should be allowed to have its own political vision for the people, you know, within its constituency area. So if that means that they clash a little when they're working with, you know, it's only a little, you know, with Forth Valley NHS or whatever, in a way, whilst we don't like the fact that doesn't run smoothly, who does? Everybody wants everything to run smoothly, right? But the reality is, we get that and we accept that and we believe that's how it should be. So there's a real issue about collaboration from that point of view. Are we in favour of it? Yes. Does that mean that councils will lose their ability to make local decisions? No, we're not in favour of that at all. So there is, I don't know if that, do you marry that? I don't know.
There about kind of organisational structures, like different governance structures and their different organisations and how do they come together. But I also wonder if there's something about skill sets where, like Maureen, I think you've mentioned conflict coming up at times. So do we have the skill sets in the workforce and maybe coming up through school where people can actually sit well with conflict, sit well with disagreement, and kind of like agree to disagree and that kind of thing. But, you know, because if ultimately what we're trying to do is create a more collaborative culture for public service reform, then maybe we need to be looking at skills development there and really supporting people with negotiating in those spaces.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I do think that accountability and a bit of an autonomy and well, mainly accountability is really important, and local democracy as well. I know that's where some collaboration has been looked at, that's created some of the conflict, because local authorities will feel that their accountability, well, not their accountability, but their local democracy is being removed from the situation. So all of these things all need to exist. Yeah.
Without meaning to be too much on the nose, right? The reality is, well, I don't disagree that there needs to be training in that, you know, the ability to manage conflict. I do agree there needs to be that. But I would also say it's easier to do that when you're not working to a budget, right? When you're not working to a budget that you're struggling to meet, where you've had to actually close 2 libraries, you know, because of the general budget pressures and stuff like that. So, you know, people are doing their best to deliver in very difficult circumstances, and that ramps everything up. It's just human nature.
It's interesting because we went to Orkney a few years ago, and one of the things that we talked about there with them was the single authority model, and so it'll be interesting to see how that develops there and in the Western Isles, because that might help, because you'd have one organisational structure within which services are being delivered. So, and that kind of maybe makes sense for local authorities of that size and scale. But I totally hear you around the kind of local democracy and the autonomy and all that kind of aspect too. I'm going to bring Fulton in with a final question, and maybe some other things will bubble up. It is a very good conversation. Thank you. Fulton, come on in.
Thanks, convener. Just a sort of final question from me then, folks. What sort of level of involvement do you feel that the trade union movement has in the Scottish Government at a national level? So in the Scottish Government's Public Service Reform Board and local authority transformation programmes, for example, what sort of input do you feel that unions have, and do you feel there could be more, and what the value of that would be?
I mean, I'm happy to sort of give an example when the National Care Service and the National Social Work Agencies have been looked at. Certainly Unison were fully involved in those conversations, and we welcomed that opportunity. That included a lot of the sort of side working groups that were looking at specific parts of those transformations. So we certainly welcomed that, and we were fully involved, and we felt that we had the opportunity to influence some of the discussions that were going on. But those are the only 2 things that I've personally been involved in. I think I can safely say that, you know, if something is going on, we will push ourselves forward, because we are the largest trade union within local government in Scotland. So we will make sure that we have a seat at the table, or several tables, to look at the various different issues that are ongoing. We're always happy to have a seat at the table and to provide input, because we do have a lot of people working for our organisation that have a lot of personal experience of working in local government, and who have a lot of skills, and are more than happy to be involved. But that's the only 2 that I've been involved in. But I would say the level of engagement that we had was good.
So I think that, first of all, I would say, just to echo what Maureen said there, Unison always want to be in the tent. You know, that is our default position. We want to be in, speaking and influencing, you know, and consulting and negotiating. So, you know, essentially, if we are invited, we will be there. If we're not invited and we know it's happening, we'll try and get invited. I have been involved with the Scottish Government working groups around the potential for sectoral bargaining within social care. It ran about 4 years ago or so, but no doubt it's still running. As Mo's saying, the engagement is really good. You're in the room, there's Scottish Government, there's COSLA, there's all the stakeholders, and you're always very careful to make sure the trade unions were there, and that is, you know, we genuinely thank you for that. However, I did start wondering at what level we weren't involved. It became clear to me that there was subsequent levels, you know, so there was like an overarching group, there was all the subgroups, and we were involved in that. And then there was something else above that, which we were kind of involved in, and then there was something else above that, and we don't know what that was, and we don't know what level we were involved in. So there's an element of you don't know what you don't know. I would suggest that we would be keen to be involved at every level possible. You know, if we are not involved, we are the workforce. You know, if we're not involved, you're not truly speaking to your stakeholders. And we would just, we would ask that consideration is given to that. It's not about the general involvement, it's about at what level and at what point that we're at the table. And obviously, sometimes there'll be certain pieces of work done, but it's the STUC, and perhaps we're contributing to an STUC delegation or whatever the case may be. Yeah, we would ask you to bear that in mind. And as I said, we will not turn down an invite.
Yeah, I know that feeling about there being something else. And that I think that certainly comes out for me where I'm in the room and I'm in a discussion and it feels like there's a decision that kind of got us to that point that's been made somewhere else. I just wanted to kind of drill in a little bit on Fulton's question around is Unison or a trade union involved in this, specifically in the Scottish Government's Public Service Reform Board? Is anybody, are you aware of that?
I actually don't know.
You don't know? All right. So that would be interesting to know. And then the other thing is also, are you brought in and involved in the Invest to Save fund? So that's that pot of money, and I think it's £6 million has gone to local authorities to bid into those funds, with the idea that with a bit of money, it's no. Okay,
I'm not involved in that. No, I would like to be.
Okay, well, so we just told you about some more doors you need to go and knock on. Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation has been really good. At the risk of, I don't know, getting jaw-dropping expressions from you, I'd be interested to get your sense. I mean, it's a very, very difficult financial climate, but there's a direction of travel around 4-day work week. So there's a workforce question. I'd be interested in your thoughts around that. Is there any hope of ever getting there? It seems to me like we might not have enough people coming in the first place to be able to move to 4-day work week. Right, both want to go in on this one. Okay.
We're just laughing because that has recently come under my remit.
Oh, really?
So there's various areas that we are looking to progress with COSLA, particularly since we now have a 2-year pay deal, and pay bargaining gives us a bit. The lack of pay bargaining gives us a bit of space. The 4-day working week is one of them. You know, we've seen the report that came out a couple of weeks ago. The Scottish Government report from the organisations that trialled it. We believe, you know, in short, we believe there's legs in it. You know, we believe that it can be good for all parties involved, and we want to explore it. We've got a commitment from COSLA to explore it, and we intend to get that moving this year. You know, within the next 12 months, essentially. But like all things, there's challenges. And it's not just a classic kind of financial challenge. There's other things we need to get right. There's things like equal pay considerations. If you've got certain groups working fewer hours for the same money, potentially, how does that impact, you know, if you've got comparator groups and stuff like that? So, you know, it's not an easy area to navigate within local government because of the diversity of roles, but yeah, we're looking to be taking that forward. We're very much interested.
As somebody who works a 4-day week, because I compress my hours, I'm a huge fan. So, you're always pushing at an open door with me with this conversation. But I think some of the organisations that have trialled it have come out with some really interesting statistics around it, and particularly around the benefit it has for workers with their work-life balance, their mental health, their general sickness absence levels. And I think when some organisations look at a 4-day week, I mean, for us it would be no detriment to our members' salaries to have a reduction in the working week. But I think when some organisations look at this, they look at it from the perspective of, well, we'll be open less days of the week or whatever. But, you know, there can be some clever ways of working around that. I mean, if an organisation's open Monday to Friday, just because workers go down to a 4-day week doesn't mean to say they're not still open Monday to Friday. It's about the days that then people work their 4 days and things. I think it's a trick that we're missing. I think it would have a positive impact on the workforce and service users as well.
And the research has been surprisingly positive. You know, I mean, I think that we always felt it would be generally positive, but it seems to be reporting win-wins. So not only have we got all the good stuff that we want for our members, you know, work-life balance and stuff, but actually productivity is going up in these organisations. Yeah. The organisation is seeing results as well. So, you know, from that point of view, it does actually kind of beg the question, you know, why wouldn't you explore it? So, you know, hopefully more to come on that.
Oh, I'm glad I asked the question, because it seems to be that's quite a positive response to what we were talking about earlier with Alexander's questions around sickness, recruitment and retention. Yeah. If we move to 4-day work week, it could be more appealing for people to come in, but also I think it could help with the kind of sickness piece, because people actually get some proper downtime, and that, as you say, work-life balance comes into play.
From my point of view, I've got an elderly parent that lives with me. Because I've got 3 days where I don't work and 4 days when I do, it allows me to manage my time much better. So, you know, for my own mental health and my ability to have those additional caring responsibilities and things, all of that feeds into that sort of flexible approach to working.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps less pressure on council services. You know, even from a childcare perspective, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, I think there's lots of detail we could dig into around what we're talking about here, but I think just generally getting that positive response from you has been very helpful. So that concludes our questions. I could ask more questions, but it's been really, really a very rich conversation with you this morning. So thanks so much for your contributions. And we previously agreed to take the next items in private. So that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we'll move into private. Thank you.